You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. Back in the days when clear beer was a goal for most homebrewers, a commonly recommended method was cold crashing, which allowed those who had the ability to chill a full fermenter to package relatively clear beer. As simple and effective as this process is, many began to express concern about one particular thing that would happen as the beer chilled. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the rather specific topic of the suckback that occurs during cold crashing and the impact it has on beer is contributor Mike Neville.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. I'm really excited to be here for my first podcast. What we're going to be talking about today is that suckback that happens, when we cold crash beer, and what potential impacts that has as far as oxidation or dilution, things like that.
Yeah, I will never forget the first time I ever cold crashed a beer. I came out to package and was surprised to find that nearly all of the sanitizer solution that was in my airlock had vanished. At the time, I was ignorantly unconcerned about cold side oxidation, though I couldn't help but wonder if even that small amount of liquid would impact my beer. In the hundreds of batches that came after that first one, I've had it happen with blow-off buckets. I've had it happen with multiple refills of an airlock if I'm cold crashing, over time and it happens too quick. At the time, I didn't really think that it had much of an impact on the quality of my beer, but I do look forward to talking with you about if it does, in fact, because you did an experiment to compare a beer that had the cold crash suckback issue compared to one that didn't. So, well, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. I am really excited about this month's guest, Barry Chan from Seattle's Lucky Envelope Brewing, who are making a name for themselves with their incredible lagers, IPA, stout, and pretty much everything else they brew is amazing. To put it simply, Barry knows what is up, and he's also just a really rad dude to boot. If you want to be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by May 20th, 2022, as Barry's going to be taking questions that Saturday, May 21st. All past sessions are available on our private Facebook page, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron of Brewlosophy at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate it. I just checked this morning and saw that we passed the 900 reviews mark in Apple Podcasts, which is crazy considering this show has only been around for about 5 years. Thanks so much to everyone who has left us a review, good, bad, or ugly. We really do take what you say to heart. Well, for those of you who have been listening to the Brewlosophy podcast for a while, you may recall a time a few years ago where we had to skip a few 1-minute beer reviews due to Jersey being away for work. I may have mentioned it back then in passing, but I'm not sure I focused on it. But what Jersey was actually doing is far more poignant today. He and a group of other F-15 pilots from the California Air National Guard were in Ukraine helping to train the pilots there. Really, really cool stuff. And now, as you're all aware, those pilots are actively defending their country. Well, one of the other pilots that went over there with Jersey is Denif, also known as Drew Army, Denif is his call sign, who just so happened to meet a local girl in Ukraine named Nastia. They fell in love. He brought her back to California. They got married, and now they're parents to an adorable little girl. Really, really great story. Of course, pretty much all of Nastia's family and lifelong friends have been impacted by the war because they still live in Ukraine. It's just really sad. I was actually having beers with Drew and Nastia a couple weeks ago, and she showed me a video that a friend of hers texted her. I mean, just from her phone, walking through their little village, and it was not pretty. Suffice to say, we are all very lucky to not have to be going through what they're going through over there right now. Given their shared love of Ukraine, the Ukrainian people. They started a fundraiser called Stop the War in Europe to provide immediate assistance to those who are defending their homes. I know there are a ton of projects aimed at helping the Ukrainian people right now, all of which are great. But what I think makes Stop the War in Europe so wonderful is that it aims to provide immediate humanitarian aid, including medical supplies, trauma kits, and other humanitarian needs to frontline units. If you're so inclined, you can learn more about this fundraiser and make donations at stopthewarineurope.org. Any amount will help. Again, that's stopthewarineurope.org. All right, first bit of feedback this week comes from listener James Wallace, who wrote in to share how he uses interesting ingredients in his brewing. This is so weird to me, I think, Mike. He says, James says, I have been homebrewing for almost 15 years and really enjoy your podcast. Thank you, James. I recently began utilizing fresh ingredients found on the farm and discovered a new way to impart bitterness and flavor. Tree bark. I have a technique I utilize to sanitize and add flavor. I was wondering how many brewers out there are using ingredients from the farm and yard. I call them yard varks. Well, James, I can honestly say that I've never used or even thought about using tree bark in my brewing. Is that something that you've ever done, Mike? I'm assuming no, but
you know what? Actually, it is. So there's a brewery down in Southern Illinois called Scratch, and they are all about using things found on the land. And my brother was down at school down there, and I would go to that brewery all the time, and they actually wrote a book, and I got to brew with the guys at Scratch, the guys and gals at Scratch. And one thing that I brought back with me was this hickory stout. And so what I actually did was collected a bunch of hickory in Michigan here, put it in an oven, roasted it a little bit, and then added that to a big bag, put it in the boil. And it's an interesting flavor, nonetheless, I would say.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Is it taste like barbecue? Because when I hear hickory, I think of barbecue.
No, it wasn't barbecue so much as it was just like a woody flavor, almost, I don't want to say oaky, a big stout, but just kind of that wood flavor came through.
Yeah, did you get bitterness from it, like James is saying?
No, it was so long ago, I'd have to look at my notes again.
So interesting. I know that foraging is there seemed to be a time maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I think even Michael Tonsmeyer did a blog post on making a beer using all foraged ingredients. Not all, of course. He used malt and stuff. But yeah, it's a popular thing. And something I certainly appreciate and I think is interesting. I'm not going to be brewing a Yardvark anytime soon. But I'd certainly be down to taste one of yours, James. So if you want to send me one, go ahead and hit me up and we'll set that up. Listener Justin Freeman had some tips after hearing our response to a recent Brew&A question regarding bulk grain storage containers. Justin said, I wanted to recommend an inexpensive or free option. Try calling local bakeries, grocery stores that have bakeries or donut shops and ask them to save frosting buckets for you. They'll be food grade with lids that may include rubber gaskets for a great seal. My grocery store saved them in various sizes from 1 to 5 gallon. You may need to wash them, but I've never had any residual smell issues after a good cleaning and drying, and it's worth the price of free. Let's be honest, you can never have enough buckets.
Yeah, that's a good, you hear a lot of people talking about using old pickle buckets, but
yeah,
the frosting bucket sounds way better to not have that pickle, residue come back through or leached into your grain or whatever it is you're using it for. That's a great idea, those frosting buckets.
Yeah, so I learned back when I tried doing this, it was pickle buckets. That was what the recommendation, right? I don't know why we weren't asking for frosting buckets back then.
Right.
And there's no denying the pickle smell that stays in those buckets. I just grabbed one to try it out, and I never put grains or anything in it. I think I might have used it for like a dump bucket for my barbecue or something like that.
Yeah.
Because the pickle smell was just a little too strong for me. The frosting thing, I think, is genius because frosting is I don't think it's going to leave any residual smell. It's easy to clean. And yeah, the bakeries are they want to get rid of those buckets. And sometimes you can drive to behind, a grocery store and you'll just see stacks of these clean buckets and they do not care if you take them. At least that's what I was told here locally. Right. So yeah, thanks for the tip, Justin. That is definitely a valid way to get some free buckets and not have to spend, your hard-earned cash on plastic buckets. So, well, thanks for writing us, James and Justin. We always appreciate hearing from our listeners. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. When we come back, our focus will be on the suckback that occurs during cold crashing and how it impacts beer. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and place your entry. You can turn $10 into $250. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/fan and use code FAN. That's code FAN at prizepicks.com/fan.
Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
I think it's probably safe to assume that the good majority of new homebrewers aren't jumping into the game with a temperature-controlled fermentation chamber, but more likely keeping their fermenting beer in a dark closet or garage and hoping the temperature doesn't get too warm. I've definitely been there. It wasn't until the obsession really bit that I converted a chest freezer into a fermentation chamber, which is also when I learned about the method of cold crashing. Now, at that time, it really seemed this method was sold as an easy way to ensure beer clarity prior to packaging that had no negative impact on beer. Let's start a little bit by talking about what exactly cold crashing is.
Yeah, so cold crashing is the process of, either placing the beer, in a refrigerator, or if you have a glycol unit, but it's essentially you're reducing the temperature of the beer once fermentation is complete. And that's going to be anywhere from 32 to 38F or 0 to 3C. And you're going to leave the beer alone for, 24 hours, if not more, before packaging. So this is going to do a few things. First being, the cold temperature encourages yeast, proteins, hop particles, and other stuff to clump together so that they'll eventually become so heavy that they'll drop out of solution. And the trube layer, as they drop down to that bottom trube layer, that will become more compact, making it way easier to transfer clear beer off the top.
Yeah, exactly. I know. I was talking with Malcolm Fraser, ex, a Brewlosophy contributor who's over doing pro brewing now in Pittsburgh. I was chatting with him about cold crashing in general, and he, far smarter than I am. He had some law, like a physics law that that had to do with whatever it is that happens when you cool down a liquid and how it kind of encourages particulate to drop out more readily. I don't know what that law is. I tried looking into it and I couldn't find it, and I don't think I emailed Malcolm soon enough. So, but there is something about it. Now, what we do know happens when you cool a liquid is that the liquid becomes more dense, and I don't know if that facilitates this behavior of particulates falling out. But what we know for sure, like you said, Mike, is that when you cool beer down, the any yeast that's in suspension is going to be, motivated to kind of clump together, to flocculate, as it were. And when it does that, it brings other stuff with it, those proteins, those polyphenols, stuff like that. And that will gently or slowly over time drop out into that trube layer, making it more compact, like you said, which makes it way easier to transfer, clearer beer into your keg. Now, I remember when I first started cold crashing, like I mentioned earlier, this was the way you got clear beer. And it was such that people would say things like, well, if you don't cold crash, your beer is never going to get clear. I just want to clear this up right now. When you package a beer, whenever you put it in the fridge, you're cold crashing. You will get similarly as clear beer. The difference is the package that when you rack that beer to the package, you are likely to have less trube in the package, which is always a good thing because it means more beer. And it also means you don't have to worry about sucking that trube up from the bottom of your keg or pouring out this big thick sludge of trube if you're bottle conditioning. The process of cold crashing, again, or the purpose of cold crashing, in my opinion at least, is so that you can rack more clear beer with less other junk to your package. That is the sole purpose, right? Right.
It's almost, you have to think of it like, when do you want to actually pull a lot of that, particulate, that extra stuff that's in the beer itself down? Do you want to pull it out, in the fermentation vessel? Or, if you don't cold crash, then you're going to be pulling it out, like you said, in the bottle or in the keg, that'll be, poured out later. So, it's almost like a time thing. Like, when do you want to actually pull this stuff out? Because eventually, as long as you cool the beer, as long as you put those bottles or you put that keg into the fridge or the keezer, that stuff will eventually come out.
Exactly. And that's why I wanted to clear that up front, is that cold crashing is not the solution to getting clear beer. It's the solution to packaging clearer beer. But that beer will eventually clear up anyways. To me, it's more, where do you want to leave the stuff you don't want to drink, the trube, right? And to me, that I want to leave that in the fermenter as much as possible. So I am a cold crasher. I mean, every beer that I make, even if it's a New England IPA, that's one of the weirdest arguments that I'll hear, right? Is, well, New England IPA or, Bavarian Weiss beer, those are supposed to be hazy. Don't cold crash it. Well, what's happening when you put it in your keezer? You're doing the same damn thing, right? So cold crashing is about where you're leaving the extra trube that you don't want in your beer. It's not about anything else. You're going to cold crash that beer at some point anyways. And again, I feel like we're beating a dead horse, but for me, I want to leave that stuff in the fermenter. Now, when do you cold crash? I think everybody will agree that you wait until fermentation is absolutely complete. I have made the mistake of thinking fermentation was complete, cold crashing and then packaging, only for the beer to get overcarbonated because it continued to ferment a little bit once it was in the keg. In fact, I think I made that mistake with a cider as well, and it does the same thing. So you want to make sure, take your FG readings, make sure your beer is completely done fermenting, and then you can reduce that temperature. A couple of things that I think you want to take into consideration when it comes to cold crashing. One of them is the ABV of the beer. How much alcohol is in that beer? You mentioned earlier, Mike, that it's pretty typical to cold crash between about 32 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 to 3C. I've made really high alcohol beers. For me, really high alcohol is like 8%. But those, you can actually drop those down to like 28 degrees C. Alcohol, the freezing point of alcohol is negative 173 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 114 C. So you can, the more alcohol that's in that beer, the lower you can take that temp, and the cooler you get that beer, I think at least, the more effective the crashing process will be.
Yeah, I mean, it will definitely be more effective, but I would say you want to be careful. I have frozen beer. Not a handful of times, but 2 or 3 times. But depending on where it is you're actually doing the cold crash, if you're taking your fermentation vessel and putting it into a keezer, and you're at maybe like between a 3 and 5 or 6% alcohol beer, if you get down into those 20s, you could potentially freeze it. And then the same thing if you're using a glycol chiller, like I have now, is you're going to want to cold crash a little bit. I want to say gentler, right? Maybe like over time, instead of like hitting it right at 20 or 30 degrees, because that cooling will actually start to freeze around whatever coil you're using to chill the beer.
Yep.
in the fermentation
I
vessel.
found that as well. I moved to glycol a couple years ago, and I did the same thing. When I would cold crash in a chamber, I would just go and set it to 32F or 0C, right, and then let it sit overnight. And it was a gentle cooling process. I mean, remember I don't have one anymore, but those infrared thermometers. I dropped mine, it busted, so I didn't buy a new one. But there was a few times where I'd go and cold crash, and I was just curious, how fast is this actually happening? It does not. The beer takes a little while to cool down. And so if I set that chamber to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, I think I came back like 4 hours later and the beer, started at 20C or 68F. And like 4 hours later, it was only down to like 60 degrees, and that was, of course, with a little sloshing around to try to homogenize the beer in there. But
yeah, I think in the chamber, it's a lot harder to freeze beer. I mean, if unless you're setting it so low, under 30 degrees, because a chamber is more of like an ambient freezing, right? It's like a refrigerator.
Exactly.
It takes a lot longer than if you're to use a glycol chiller with a coil. I mean, you're hitting that beer like instantly with that cold temperature coming through. So.
Yeah, and I noticed that. That's what I was going to say, is that when I switched to glycol the first time that I cold crashed, I didn't think to do anything different. I just set it to 30C.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, not 30C. That's 100 or 90 degrees. I set it to 30F, which is like -1C, and it definitely chilled the beer very, very quickly. And when I removed those coils, there was little ice crystals kind of up towards the top of it.
Yep.
So just to be careful with that, I've learned that when cold crashing with glycol, and I know that we're kind of going down the glycol path here. We can stop doing that. Yeah. But when cold crashing with glycol, you do not need to set it as cold as you do with the chamber. At least that's been my experience. So
sure.
Now, one thing I wanted to point out is when you're for those who bottle condition, there's a common myth out there, and I'm going to be brazen and call it a myth, that don't cold crash when you're bottle conditioning, all the yeast is going to drop out, yada, yada. That is not true whatsoever. The best beers that I've ever bottle conditioned, which aren't many, but also some of the better beers that my friends, my brother have bottle conditioned have been ones where they package it after cold crashing, and there is more than enough yeast left in solution to munch on that priming sugar that you toss in there and carbonate your beer. And the nice thing is the true layer on the bottom of those bottles, it looks almost like that dusting that you see on the bottom of a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale bottle or another commercial bottle conditioned beer.
Pretty.
And that is what I want. I don't want it. Yeah, it's very pretty. It's nice. The beer is clear. Stuff isn't getting knocked into solution. That's the way to do it, in my opinion, if you have the ability to do so. So obviously there are some really positives behind cold crashing. Again, if you have the capacity in your brewery to do it, but there are some, I suppose we could call them cons of cold crashing as well.
Yeah. A few of the cons, and this is where the experiment, which we'll discuss in the next segment, really stems from. But what happens when you reduce the temperature of the liquid, it contracts, and that's going to create a vacuum, right? So, on bigger commercial systems or commercial tanks, probably less so on the fermentation vessels that we use as homebrewers, but these sealed vessels, depending on how much liquid is in there, and as they're contracting, the vessel itself can start to implode, which is a pretty amazing thing. And then on a more homebrew scale, right, we're going to be using airlocks or blow-offs submerged in liquid, and they're with that contraction of the liquid, the contraction of the beer, right? The liquid from whatever is in the blow-off vessel or in the airlock will start to come back into the fermentation vessel.
It's simple physics, right?
Yep.
When there is a vacuum created because of the reduction of temperature, something has to happen. It's not just going to, not happen. There was this time, I started to notice, like I said, the very first time I cold crashed, I noticed all of the liquid in my airlock was gone, and I kind of put two and two together and didn't think a fairy came in and drank it all. No, it got sucked into my beer. And so I had this idea. Well, I'm just going to buy a solid bung for my PET carboy, and I'll just put that on there and we'll be good. No suck back. It'll be all good, right? Well, lo and behold, that solid bung got sucked like halfway down into the neck of my PET carboy. I know. It was it was one of those bungs where you put it in the top and it kind of almost fits all the way in, but there was maybe like an eighth of an inch sticking out of the top. So I thought, perfect. I can pull that out when it's done. It I had to like pop it in. It was a pain in the butt. And not only that, the carboy like started to concave on itself, right? Kind of implode. Thankfully, I was able to save the beer and we were able to make it work. But I learned my lesson quick there. You don't mess around with pressures like that. Even on the homebrew scale, it's pretty incredible to witness. I've done a similar thing with a stainless steel. It was a stainless SS brew bucket, and I just put a solid bung on the top and didn't even think about it. And when it's stainless, it's going to be fine. The lid on that got sucked down so hard that it lost its seal. I mean, the air had to find its way in, and I had to get a new lid for that brew bucket.
Yeah, that's actually what I used to do before I was able to, cold crash under pressure. Is I would take my SS brew buckets and just put them in the refrigerator and then put that solid bung in there. But yeah, like you said, there must be some sort of way that the oxygen will still get into the vessel.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the bigger issue that most people have, because they're not replacing the airlock or their blow off tube with they're smarter than I am, basically. They're not replacing it, is that there is suckback that occurs. And if you hit the internet, you are going to find hundreds and hundreds of stories of people asking about, hey, I started cold crashing and it sucked, 2 liters of sanitizer solution into the beer. Is it okay to drink? It is such a common issue. And there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, that's going to ruin your beer. Or they're on the other end of it. There's people saying, I did it and it didn't ruin my beer. It seemed fine. There's still a lot of even if it doesn't, if the beer's still drinkable, there's still a lot of downsides. One, you just lost all predictability. If you're a nut like me who likes to kind of produce a consistent product, you just lost that piece of it. Two, you're sucking in more than just the liquid, ostensibly. I mean, you're sucking in air, which could have contaminants in it. You are diluting the beer. All kinds of stuff that can happen when you're not paying attention to that, and you end up getting that suckback.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that you're potentially could be, happening is if you're using a sanitizer solution in a blow off or in an airlock with that getting sucked back in there could be some flavor impacts introduced to the beer, right? I mean, Star San, iodophor, they all have flavors, and do you necessarily want that flavor, in your beer? I mean, of course you don't.
The answer is no.
No, of course you don't, right? But
yeah.
It's just something that will happen if left unattended, I guess.
Yeah, and one of the more funny occurrences that I've read about, and it's funny that I've read about this from more than one person, like multiple people, is that they will have, let's say that they put their fermentation vessel down on the floor of their chest freezer fermentation chamber, and then they put a bucket with Star San or iodophor solution up on the hump, and then it sucks in, and even though it stopped, the vacuum stopped, it creates a siphon, and the entire volume of this blow off liquid gets siphoned into their beer. And I mean, I would hate, that's never happened to me. I can deny that one. I've had, I think the most I've had sucked in is maybe like 1 liter of Star San, and I was so bummed when it happened. But
yeah, that also hasn't happened to me. But you also have to think, after that gallon or however much liquid got sucked back into the fermenter, right? What was next? It was oxygen. It was air. It was all that other stuff coming in, after.
Yeah. Now, I have to believe that the majority of brewers out there, home brewers at least out there, are using some form of a sanitizer solution for their airlocks and for their blow off vessels. I know some people like to use like neutral grain spirits like vodka or Everclear. I've never done that because the Star San solution is easier and cheaper in my experience, and I've never had an issue with it. But we're going to be talking about iodophor in particular on this episode, but I feel like the same goes for if you're using a spirit alcohol as well. I don't want that going into my beer. And then even so, when it's all in there and you're still creating that vacuum, you're still getting the air and any other potential contaminants added to the beer as well. So
yeah, I think if you were to use like a grain alcohol, it's like you said, there's a cost, right? So like you're either going to use like good alcohol, which you don't want to use because that costs more money, or you're going to use cheap alcohol, but I don't want that cheap alcohol going into my beer either.
Right. I agree completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially when I didn't plan for it to be there. And
For
I
sure.
think that gets to my neuroses with this is like, I want to be able to know everything that's happening and to be able to go back to my recipe and say, this is what's in there. And when you have something as trivial as it might sound, like, 4 or 5 ounces, upwards of a liter even of iodophor or Star San solution getting sucked back into this beer that you worked so hard to make, even if it doesn't, ruin the beer, there's just still this part of me that's like, damn it, that's not what I planned,
Yeah, absolutely.
So what is your sanitizer of choice? I know that in my brewery, I go back and forth between Star San and iodophor. And for Star San, we know that is kind of a phosphoric acid based sanitizer solution that becomes this yeast nutrient. It really does not seem to have much of an impact on beer character, and it may actually be beneficial for yeast, they say. But I also use iodophor in between batches of Star San just to mix things up a little bit. And in my experience, the iodophor doesn't seem to last as long. Like if I make a bucket of it, it doesn't seem to last as long. But are you an iodophor or Star San person in general?
In general, I'm more of a Star San person. I'll actually flip to Santiclean every once in a while, but I do have iodophor on hand, and it does come out every once in a while, just like as you said, to mix things up. And like you said, that it does seem like iodophor lasts for less time. I mean, when you mix that iodophor solution to the recommended dose, like it has this light brown color, and then after a while, at least I've seen it, it'll start to almost go clear again, which I don't know if that is it's not working anymore, or that. Yeah,
total. I've absolutely experienced that where the iodophor starts to get lighter in color, almost to the point of looking like it's just water again. And yeah, my understanding is that means it's lost its effectiveness. And iodophor does that. It's just one of the things that it's known for, but it is a very, very effective sanitizer, and one that I have used many times for my blow-off vessel as well as for my airlocks. And it's definitely one that I've had sucked back on. Now, just a little disclaimer: we are focusing on iodophor in this episode because that is what we did for the experiment we're going to get to. We have done experiments in the past that have looked at, say, the impact of Star San foam on beer character and the presence of a fairly decent amount of Star San with beer. So you can go back and listen to those episodes, read those experiments. This one we are focusing a bit more on iodophor. Now, what exactly is iodophor? I did some poking around. I give credit to the 5-star folks because that's where I pulled this information from. But it's just a term used for solutions containing iodine and a solubilizing agent like a surfactant, which allows the iodine to be slowly released into the solution. It is a no-rinse sanitizer that works by penetrating cell walls and membranes of unwanted microbes and interfering with DNA synthesis. Now, by no rinse, that just means that once you've sprayed it on, or if you fill up a bucket and dip stuff in there, you can get away with removing that stuff, not rinsing it off with clean water and using it. I know a lot of people like to rinse the iodophor off because it does have a very pungent medicinal smell. I mean, if you've ever been in a hospital, you have smelled iodine, and it's not a pleasant smell. And it's certainly, I don't know about you, Mike, but it's certainly more than enough to leave me concerned if that stuff is going into my beer. It just does not smell very good.
Yeah, absolutely. The smell is there, but also, when you're talking about rinsing off your equipment, I mean, there is also the discoloration that you're going to have on your equipment. Yep. Essentially, if you're anything that is, plastic is going to start to take on that brown coloration. So
yep.
If you don't want that on your equipment, you could rinse it off, but I'm definitely a no rinse, whether it comes to iodophor, Star San, Santiclean, anything. If it says no rinse on the bottle, I am no rinse, because I just think that whatever is in your water, no matter how clean you think it is, you're just potentially reinfecting whatever you just sanitized. So
I've never rinsed iodophor off either. I just wanted to give credit to those who do. Yeah,
sure.
But it is a no rinse sanitizer. Like I didn't even consider the permanent discoloration that sanitizing with iodophor does. If you've ever had a white bucket, maybe it was a X frosting bucket.
Sure.
If you've ever had one and you let iodophor solution sit into it and you pour it out, it's brown. I mean, and that's just what it does. And I think it makes sense that people might be concerned that whatever's causing that coloration change, whatever's causing that medicinal smell, would not be good in beer. Now, Is iodophor toxic? In its concentrated form, you don't want to drink the stuff. But when it's diluted down to that, what I think is like 12 ppm is the recommended dosage for sanitizing in breweries. When it's diluted down to that point, it is very, very safe, super low toxicity. You're not going to want to be drinking a full pint of this stuff. But the amount that does get sucked back in your typical cold crashing, process, whether that be the couple ounces from your airlock or even up to a liter or so from a blow-off vessel, ostensibly that is not going to hurt you. I know there are people out there who have a very strong belief that anything that makes its way into the beer, you got to let people know because they could have an allergy. When it comes to iodophor, I kind of am on the same page with that. I know that there are people who have, iodine allergies, and I would just want to stay safe from that. Does that medicinal characteristic make its way to the beer? In my experience, I don't know about you, Mike, prior to your experiment on this, did you ever notice, I'm assuming you had the suckback issue when using iodophor for the cold crashing process. I never really noticed the medicinal thing when I've had that happen to me.
No, I've never really noticed anything, any of that medicinal character come through either. When I'm cold crashing, either iodophor or Star San. So
yeah, and that's been my experience. That seems to be the kind of the running theme. If you read about these stories online, is that people are like, it doesn't really have much of an impact. The beer was still good. Now, I've personally used both iodophor and Star San in my airlock and blow off buckets, and I'd be lying if I said I haven't experienced the whole suckback issue many, many times. Anecdotally, again, I have not had a beer ruined by this happening, but you were curious to see if it had any impact at all, Mike, and you put it to the test. Results when we return from this short break. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and place your entry. You could turn $10 into $250. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/fan and use code FAN. That's code FAN at prizepicks.com/fan.
Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
I have to believe most homebrewers have had the experience of going out to package a beer that's been cold crashing for some period of time, only to find that a good portion of the liquid in their blow-off container or airlock had been sucked into their beer. Curious to see what impact this has on beer. You put it to the test, Mike.
Yeah, so for this experiment, before I was able to cold crash under pressure, we talked about in the last segment, I would, put the fermenter in the refrigerator or in the chamber and cold crash that way. And I would have that suck back happen, overnight or however long until I packaged it. So I had never really done a side-by-side before. And that's and I never experienced any, negative effects that I had thought. So that's why I wanted to put this one to the test. So for this one, I just did a single 10-gallon batch of American Pale Ale. It was 83% pale malt, 9% Munich, 6% Vienna, and 2% Special Roast.
Now, I think choosing an American Pale Ale for this one was a really good call because American Pale Ale is hoppy, and we know that hoppier beers tend to be more sensitive to oxygen. Of course, the real idea, and I think the motivation for you to do this experiment was to see what impact the Sanitizer has on the beer. But a kind of a secondary observation is, well, what happens with the air that gets sucked back in as well? Are we going to see some oxidation occurring in the suck back beer over the other one? So good call on that one.
Yeah, I wanted the middle of the road kind of style. Like I didn't want a pale, German lager beer, and I didn't want some crazy hopped, American IPA. So I just wanted that nice American Pale Ale, kind of run the middle. So for the brewing process, mashed at 150 degrees F or 66 C for 60 minutes. Once the mash was complete, I batch sparged to collect the full volume of wort and then boiled for 60 minutes. And the kettle hop additions were 7 grams of CTZ at 60 minutes, and then 27 grams of Caliente and 20 grams each of CTZ and Galaxy at 5 minutes.
Yum.
Yeah. And then when the boil was complete, the wort was chilled, and the hydrometer measurement showed that the wort was at 1056. Was my OG.
My favorite OG for an American Pale Ale, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, you can't beat it. So from there, the wort was split evenly into 2 Spike Brewing Flex Plus fermenters, which are pressure rated to about 15 psi. And then I pitched a single pouch of Imperial A01 House into each batch. And then I used my glycol unit to maintain a fermentation temperature of 60 degrees F or 20 C for about 10 days before taking hydrometer measurement, showing both beers were at the same finishing gravity of 1007.
Yeah, so that's okay. So just to reiterate, now these beers have spent 10 days at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is your standard ale, fermentation temperature. That's 20 C. Before you confirmed that fermentation was complete. Just to reiterate, you don't want to start cold crashing until you know fermentation's complete. I have brewed similar strength American Pale Ales with Imperial House, the A01 House strain. And in my experience at that temperature, fermentation is done in like 4 days, right? 4 to 5 days. Especially with as fresh a yeast as we get. We're very fortunate to be sponsored by Imperial, and we get very, very fresh yeast. Now, I'm assuming fermentation was probably done at that 4 to 5 day mark, but you let them sit 10 days before taking that FG measurement just to be sure that fermentation was complete.
Yeah, not only that, but there was a dry hop addition, so I wanted the beer to be, the beer was likely done, as you said, 4 to 5 days in. Then I hit it with the dry hop and then waited another, 4 or 5 days before taking that hydrometer measurement to confirm that 1007.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So from here, the beers have been treated exactly the same, right? All the specs are the same, which is great. And this is where the variable is going to be introduced. So in preparation for the cold crash, the blow-off tube was removed from one of the fermenters, and I pressurized it with just a very small amount of CO2 to maintain positive pressure. It was down to 1 or 2 psi. And then for the other batch, the end of the blow-off tube was placed into a flask that contained 1 liter of iodophor solution, and I diluted this to the recommended 12.5 ppm concentration. From here, the glycol chillers were set to 38 to bring the beer down to that temperature.
And I, again, we talked about this earlier, but in my experience with glycol chillers, the cold crashing temperature is going to be, I don't know if it's because we're chilling the actual beer with, like, there's coils in the beer chilling it, from the inside out as opposed from the outside in, like you would in a chamber. But again, I cold crash to 36 or 38 degrees Fahrenheit now, which is like 2 to 3 C, when I'm using my glycol, whereas with my chamber, I'd always just set it to 30 or 32, 30 or 32F. So -1 to 0C. And that worked effectively as well. Again, this is I feel like the temperature is a weird thing because most people aren't using glycol at this point, and they're probably used to cooler cold crashing temperatures, but there's a reason those of us doing glycol, at least with, these kind of moderate strength beers, not super high alcohol, there's a reason we're going slightly higher. Yeah.
And I think too that of course, the temperature difference between 29 and 38, you will accelerate, faster if it's at 29. But I haven't really noticed any like significant acceleration between those two temperatures. So, and I've actually run into problems before if I, start to get below 35, down to 34 or 33, with beer, or not really beer, but with water freezing on those coils on the inside, taking that whatever water is in the beer and starting to freeze on those coils. So, yeah. But that 38 is just my standard, cold crash temperature.
Yeah, for glycol, like I said, I'm that 36 to 38F. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Now, as you started this cold crashing thing, I think you made some pretty interesting observations that you note in the article. Why don't you tell us about what it is that you saw at what was just a few hours after you reduced the temperature of the beer? And again, just to reiterate, glycol chillers chill beer way faster than a fermentation chamber does. So,
yeah. So when I set it to 38, the blow off tube was in the liter of iodophor solution. Walked away, went back upstairs. Went on with my day. I came back 6 hours later, and almost everything was pulled out of the flask, which was amazing. There was probably only about 100 mils left of solution at the bottom of the flask, and just let it ride overnight. The next morning I came back, and there was nothing in the flask.
When you're doing these types of experiments where you could potentially ruin a beer, which is what makes us crazy. I get that we're willing to potentially ruin beers for the sake of learning something new about this thing that we love. Though, there was a part of you that's like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as soon as I saw down to 100 mils, I knew the rest of it was coming out overnight. I was like, should I fill it with more sanitizer, or do I let air come through? I mean, I was like freaking out, just like any home brewer would for about 10 minutes. Like, nope, you got to stay the course. We're just going to let
that's right.
Whatever happens, happen. So 24 hours later, came back. And I took a hydrometer measurement to see what was going on with the beer with that liter of solution into it. And it turns out that the beer was 0.0005 gravity points lower than the batch that was crashed under pressure.
Yeah, so that makes sense. Now, again, 0.0005 SG points is literally 1/2 of a specific gravity point. In our other experiments, I would write that off as being the same FG, but we were looking, we're using a very precise final gravity hydrometer because we were curious what the impact was. Again, it's just 1 liter of solution that was added to the cold crashed beer, so I wouldn't expect there to be a huge difference in specific gravity, but there was this kind of 1/2 degree difference. I doubt that that's going to be, the culprit for a flavor difference. But like you mentioned, it sucked all of that liquid in there, and it still had to do some sucking. So there was some air that made its way into that fermenter, ostensibly as well.
Yeah. So at this point, the beer, was probably taking on air for at least 16 hours or so.
Yeah, it's hard to predict like how long that vacuum was pulling, but it clearly, after what did you say, 5 or 6 hours? I mean, pretty much all of the sanitizer was already sucked in, and I'd have to imagine that it wasn't done. It wasn't done shrinking. That wort wasn't done shrinking yet, and so it probably did suck in a good few liters of ambient air that was just out in your garage, basically, right? I mean, that's where you have your fermentation vessels set up. That's where you had the blow off vessel, your flask. So I have to imagine it took on a pretty decent, amount of ambient air.
Yeah, absolutely.
And based on what we know about cold side oxidation, I would think at least that could very well, have some sort of a perceptible impact on the beer.
Yeah, absolutely. So once, after that 24 hours, both beers were pressure transferred to CO2 purged kegs. And then they were placed in my keezer and burst carbonated overnight before the gas was reduced to serving pressure. Now, I let these beers condition for about a week before they were ready to serve to tasters.
Awesome. So you let them condition, you let them carbonate in your fermentation vessel, or I'm sorry, in your keezer, and they were ready to serve to tasters. Now, before you served them to tasters, you obviously did your own set of triangle tests. You checked them out. I would expect, and especially in a dry hopped American Pale Ale, I would expect if there was any signs of cold side oxidation or oxygen exposure on the cold side, I'd expect that the cold crash suck back beer, if you will, to be, perceptibly different or visibly different, darker in appearance, right? Because we know that tends to happen in oxidized beer. Did you see any differences in these beers when you started your evaluations?
Yeah, no, I didn't see any sort of, dulling. You'll see in oxidized beer, there'll kind of be a dulling in color. I didn't see any of that. Both beers were very similar in color, clarity. The foam was the same. There was no real visible signs of any sort of oxidation at this point. So
yeah, and I wouldn't expect to see any signs of or any differences in appearance just based on the 1 liter of iodophor solution that made its way into the 5 gallons of beer. That's almost 20 liters of beer. So I'm looking at the picture now. They look identical to me. So
yep, yeah, they looked identical in real life too. So there was no visual signs of any whatever. Either the iodine or the iodophor, or the any sort of oxygen that came in. So I did my own, personal tastings, my semi-blind triangle test. I did 5 attempts, and out of my 5 attempts, I was only able to get 2 correct. So these beers were identical to me. Pretty much in every way. I was not able to tell them apart. Even side by side, tasting them, they tasted completely the same.
I mean, I would have expected at over a liter. I mean, that is, what is that? Almost 5 to 5. It's like 5% or whatever of the amount of the total volume of the beer that you would, iodophor has such a strong smell, that medicinal smell. If it were Star San, I don't know if I'd be as concerned, but that much iodophor solution, I would have expected that you would have picked up at least some sort of kind of maybe like what we might misperceive as a phenol or something like that. And you're saying they tasted identical, which is
that medicinal character.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, obviously, you are the brewer, you were biased, so you did serve these to 21 participants. And we want to give a shout out to the folks at Cadillac Straits Brewing Company for letting you hang out at their brewery and collect data there.
Yeah. So we had a total of 21 participants for this triangle test. And we would have expected 12 to get it right, to call it significant. In the end, only 8 people got this one right. So that's 38%, and this one was not significant.
In a triangle test, if it is people are randomly choosing between 3 identical beers, you expect 33%, give or take, to select each beer. 8 out of 21, 38% falls right within that. You'd expect 38% if the beers were identical. And in this case, it really does seem that the beers were not perceptibly different. We have to qualify that by saying to this group of tasters with this style of beer, with the amount of iodophor solution that ended up getting sucked back in. And I think that that's pretty telling, that the iodophor certainly didn't seem to have a perceptible impact on the beer in terms of aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel. But it also seemed like the oxidation as well as the iodophor didn't have much of an impact anywhere else either. They looked identical. They smelled, tasted identical. They felt the same way in your mouth. That's pretty impressive to me that you can get away with that level of suckback. Now, again, we are not encouraging people to pour, iodophor solution into your beer, but in those cases where, you forget that your suckback solution is still there or whatever, that happens, it really does seem like it's not going to have much of an impact negatively on your beer.
Yeah, when we were discussing this earlier, in my old ways of, cold crashing in the refrigerator, I would worry about it, but I would worry about it, but I could also, at the same time, I wasn't able to really tell a difference in the beers I was brewing at the time. And this just kind of reinforces that it might not have as big an impact as we might think.
Exactly. And I'm still going to worry about it because I'm a home brewer and that's what we do. I'm definitely not going to change from, I now cold crash under pressure, which I far prefer. I don't even like the thought of ambient air being sucked into my fermentation vessel, and that's not even given the sanitizer solution piece of this. So I'm doing everything I can to avoid this from happening, but it is kind of nice to know that should it occur, one, it's not going to make you sick. Two, you're probably going to end up with a decently good beer still that's not ruined. So really cool experiment. I thought the results were fascinating. This is one where I have to admit I didn't expect people weren't going to be able to tell it apart. I thought it would be significant, and the fact it wasn't, again, just another surprise for me. So, well, we've got a few reader comments to get to. The first one comes from somebody else named Mike, who says, I've also found that the 1 or 2 ounces of Star San sucked back from an airlock did not negatively influence any brew it happened to, although I didn't have another beer to compare it to. What was more concerning was the exposure to air for that time. I know there's some gadgets you can buy or make that prevent this. These days I ferment in corny kegs, which solves that problem anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, obviously, if you're fermenting in corny kegs, you're able to, add that pressure while you're cold crashing. But yeah, there are a number of contraptions out there that you can. I think the one that Mike was talking about, it's like a 2-vessel mason jar system that pushes sanitizer into one and into the other, and then when you cold crash, some of that sanitizer comes back into the first vessel, but you're not actually pulling that up into the beer.
It's a clever little gadget. I've used one a few times, and I didn't find it to be as effective as others have. And since I'm using gear that allows me to cold crash under pressure, I just found that to be far more convenient. But yeah, there are. And I agree with Mike that my bigger concern is the air or the potential for oxidation, not so much the sanitizer solution getting sucked in. So, next comment comes from Matt Diaz, I believe, who says, I had iodophor solution sucked back a couple of times and was more scared about the potential health impact of ingesting iodine than what could happen to the beer. I was even afraid of sharing those beers with friends and family. Was this a concern for you guys? I just want to say up front that it wasn't really much of a concern for us because there's a lot of good info out there. And I actually really like the response from another reader named Joe, who explained that iodine is a necessary trace nutrient with a recommended daily allowance of 150 micrograms for most adults. The upper limit on consumption is unclear, but checking multiple sources, it appears to routinely be above 1 milligram per day. The 5-gallon batch of beer in this experiment sucked back 1 liter of iodophor solution at 12.5 ppm, if I'm doing my math right, and there's been no biological or chemical processes to decrease the iodine content. That works out to roughly 300 micrograms per pint, which is 1, above the recommended daily allowance, and 2, well below even the most conservative estimate for hazardous daily intake. Conclusion, says Joe, beer with iodophor suckback is health food.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that was a little concern that I had too, but after reading his response, it makes sense. The other thing to consider is, serving these beers to participants. I'm not serving a full pint to, everyone's not getting 3 full pints of beer. You're getting just a small sample, 3-4 ounce sample of each one. So it really should not be, an issue.
Yeah. And it's a fair question, right? Are
Absolutely.
we taking into account the potential health effects of this? And we do with all of these ones. And we pre-research, these things, and the amount of iodophor that was in the small, 2 to 3 ounces of in each glass that people usually just sip off of. It was not anywhere near enough to be of concern. But it's certainly something that we take into consideration. So, well, Mike, that is all the time we've got for this episode. Any last words on the suckback of sanitizer solution that occurs when cold crashing beer?
Yeah, no, I just think that don't be so concerned about it, right? I mean, it is something you should definitely consider in your brewing process, but if it happens to you, if you don't have the some of the equipment, maybe don't worry so much about it, and the beer will be fine.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's not something that I'm going to, again, recommend people do, but should it happen on accident, I don't know if I'd worry as much about it as I did in the past. And I'm glad that we've got at least a little bit of data here that can kind of, buttress that opinion. All right. Don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with the folks behind the scenes who are helping us to better understand this beverage we all love so much. And as always, you can learn more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Looking for a fun way to win up to 25 times your money this basketball season? Test your skills on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and place your entry. You could turn $10 into $250. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit up to $100. Just visit prizepicks.com/fan and use code FAN. That's code FAN at prizepicks.com/fan.
Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.